Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3. I'll provide an overview of the key changes between R2 2013 and R2V3. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on the first slide here. We will cover a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll go through at a high level some of the benefits of certification to a standard such as R2. We'll cover transition details for clients who will transition from R2 2013 to R2V3. We'll spend the bulk of our time on the key changes in the standard. I'll close with a summary of the certification process for clients who, instead of transitioning, are actually pursuing a new initial certification, give them an idea of what to expect there. And we will have time for questions at the end. Feel free to type those into the chat field at any point throughout the presentation, but I will save those for last. Today's webinar is being recorded. You can find a copy of the slides as well as a copy of the recording on PGR's website in the next couple of days. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading certification bodies in the world. We have certified clients around the globe. This is not necessarily an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a certification body. Similarly, we are accredited to grant certification for a wide variety of standards. The subject of today's webinar is R2, or Responsible Recycling, as it was once called a couple revisions ago. Some of these other standards may also look familiar to any management systems or organizations that have integrated management systems or certifications to other standards in addition to R2. Benefits of certification for a standard such as R2 vary by industry and location, but some common themes include that commitment to responsibly reusing and recycling electronics. That's the backbone of the standard we're discussing today. So being able to advertise that commitment or that responsibility for the electronics and the electronic components is certainly one of the key benefits of certification. Maintaining the R2 management system requirements drives improvement to an organization's environmental health and safety performance in implementing and maintaining the standard requirements. It also supports or creates a framework for meeting customer and regulatory requirements. Again, in implementing and maintaining the standard requirements, you are developing that framework. Implementing the system or the standard requirements also drives improvements or increases in areas such as management commitment and employee engagement levels. Maintaining a certification such as R2 can provide a competitive advantage bidding for contracts in, for example, in areas where the competitors perhaps do not hold the R2 certification or a similar certification. Again, there could be a competitive advantage there. I mentioned earlier being able to advertise the commitment to responsible reuse and recycling. That can go a long way in terms of improving public image as well. Beyond the competitive advantage we already discussed, there may be other financial benefits. Again, sometimes these vary by location and industry. Maintaining certifications can, in some instances, for example, lead to lower insurance premiums. I was trying to think of another example off the top of my head, but that was all I came up with. Implementing and maintaining a certification also helps achieve strategic objectives that the corporate parent or the organization may hold or that stakeholders may require. The standard also offers the ability to integrate the standard management system with other business management systems. We showed a variety of other standards with which R2 can be integrated, but the business management system can also be integrated while fulfilling the R2 requirements. For those of you listening today who have current R2 2013 certificates, you fall into the category of transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3. So these next couple of slides with the transition details would be primarily for you. Obviously, the R2V3 standard is already published since we are already conducting audits to it. You can find it through CERI's website. You can also find the transition plan published via Code of Practice Advisory 22 through CERI's websites. You can also find the current version of the Code of Practices for R2V3 through the CERI website. CERI has developed and is continuing to maintain a knowledge base on their website with a whole host of information. They're utilizing this in lieu of a formal guidance document. So there are Q&As, there are articles, there are training videos, there is a multitude of information on the knowledge base, and I encourage you to explore that, to look there when you have questions about the standard. It can be a really valuable resource. And obviously today's free 1-hour webinar is not meant to take the place of any formal CERI offered R2 training. R2V3 transition audits can be virtual in some instances. So the default approval, if a client was a good virtual candidate, had the infrastructure in place to meet the requirements, was initially up to 50% of the audit could be virtual. Advisory 24 has now been published, which allows fully virtual transition audits for auditors that have been trained to the advisory and for clients who meet the additional requirements that the advisory imposes. So this won't necessarily be a good fit for all transition audits for all clients or for all auditors, but it is an opportunity that we are now able to offer. Advisory 22, the transition plan I mentioned earlier, provided a staggered transition expectation for facilities based on their R2 2013 certificate expiration date. So if you haven't already checked out Advisory 22 to understand when you may be required to transition, I highly suggest you do so. PGR had to obtain accreditation to R2V3 before we could issue accredited certificates. Accreditation has been achieved and we are currently issuing accredited certificates. PGR has its own version of a transition plan, which was made available to our clients with an internal deadline. We recommend making sure that your transition audit takes place no later than March 30th of next year, 2023, if you were not already required to transition before that date. So this would be the latest date if the transition plan, allows such a late transition to avoid a lapse in certification. And the reason why I want to stress that during my slides is that it's not enough to have your audit by the deadline. There are a lot of certification decision-making activities that take place after the audit concludes that we need to allow sufficient time for. If your audit takes place and all of these other activities have not occurred prior to the expiration of your certificate or the deadline for transition, you will have a period of time in which you're not certified. And depending on the dates and the lapse, you could also have to start all over with your audits. So we really want to avoid situations where the certificate is not issued prior to the transition deadline. Please keep this in mind when you're discussing scheduling of your transition audit with your scheduler or your PJR team. As I mentioned, Advisory 22 had a staggered approach within it based on the R2 2013 expiration date. So for clients whose R2 2013 certificates were expiring last calendar year, they were able to recertify to R2 2013 one more time rather than having to transition at that recertification audit, provided the audit was completed within the calendar year 2021. So currently in 2022, We are seeing clients whose R2 2013 certificates are expiring this calendar year or next calendar year. In those cases, you're required to transition at your recertification audit if it's in 2022, certainly your recertification audit if it's in 2023, or if you're in your surveillance cycle for both 2022 and 2023, you do need to transition before the overall deadline, which is June 30th of 2023. You may recall on the last slide, PGR's recommendation is March 30th, 2023 for your audit to be scheduled to conclude by March 30th, 2023 to prevent a lapse in certification because of the certification decision-making activities that take place post-audit. This could include closing of the nonconformities, the technical review of the package, the need for revisits to close any nonconformities issued against the R2V3 standard, and the time it takes to pay any outstanding balances that you may have, since a certificate will not be issued with outstanding balances, the time for approving a draft certificate to make sure all of the information is correct, and finally issuing that final certificate. You are permitted by Advisory 22 to transition sooner should you wish. So if you have surveillance audits in 2022 and 2023 and you would like to transition in 2022, that would be appropriate. This is something that you should discuss with your scheduler as you plan your 2022 and 2023 audits. We want to, of course, ensure that we have adequate resources to support the majority of our clients who have not yet transitioned. So if it is feasible for your organization to transition, such as in the second half of 2022, we highly recommend that you do so. If you're not planning to transition this calendar year, we also highly suggest that you book dates with your auditor for 2023 for when you will transition so that those audit dates are accounted for and we won't run into a situation where we don't have auditor availability to staff the audit during the period in which you are looking to schedule. I also want to mention that the transition audit, whenever it does take place, constitutes the equivalent of stage 1 and stage 2 audit time, as this is the prescribed audit time calculation requirements in the R2V3 Code of Practice. So whereas you may have been due for a surveillance audit for R2 2013, if you're transitioning, this restarts the 3-year certification cycle and the audit time will be higher. This is required by the R2V3 Code of Practice to cover all of the core requirements and all applicable process requirements within the standard for that first initial audit to the R2V3 standard. And we'll cover those core requirements and process requirements throughout my slides. I did put some of the transition information into a timeline. Sometimes a visual representation is helpful. And again, you'll be able to obtain a copy of today's slides from PGR's website should you be interested in going back and referencing these. This information is also from Advisory 22. I don't want to spend a lot of time in today's presentation focusing on why the standard was revised. This was more relevant when the R2V3 standard first came out. Certainly the slides are still within the presentation that you can download. The standard was revised for a number of reasons. There are some common reasons across all of the standard revisions, and some are more specific to R2, such as feedback from customers, clients, auditors, certification bodies, and the TAC. Getting into some of the key changes with the standard, I do want to emphasize that there are no changes to the intent of the standard. While the structure and the requirements may differ, the overall original intent is maintained. So emphasis is given to reusing electronics first and foremost, rather than recycling or any of the other destruction methods, it is always preferred if the items can be reused, refurbished, um, to keep them in the use stream. You can see from the table of contents on this slide, just a snapshot of the standard itself. We see some pretty significant changes in the structure of the standard just by looking at that table of contents. The R2V3 standard compared to R2 2013 has been divided into two sections. We see the first section is the core requirements and the second is the process requirements. The process requirements, also known as the appendices, are found in the appendices of the standard, and those are applied as applicable based on a given R2 facility's scope of operations, whereas the core requirements will apply to all R2V3 organizations. The process requirements will vary based on their scope of activities. There continues to be a significant emphasis on reuse, as I mentioned, since the intent of the standard is the same, but there is an increase in the amount of prescriptive guidance or requirements in key areas such as data security, electronic testing, and repair processes. Of course, the revision of the standard includes clarifying requirements which may not have been well understood or effectively implemented across the varying certification bodies, clients, and auditors to really ensure the intent of the standard is upheld. I showed in the table of contents the restructuring of the standard. We can also see that the grouping and the number of what was previously called provisions has been altered as well. There are 10 core requirements compared to the 13 provisions that were found in R2 2013. Another key change in the R2V3 standard is the creation of the R2 equipment categorization document, also known as the REC. We'll spend a little bit of time covering the REC towards the end of the presentation. Another key change in R2V3 is the requirement for some R2 facilities to obtain or maintain, a certified quality management system. This is relevant to certain process requirements or appendices. Again, those appendices will vary by R2 facility based on their scope. So I do want to emphasize that in some instances, depending on the scope and the applicable appendices, you will see an additional requirement to have a certified quality management system. Previously, the prerequisites for R2 only included the certified environmental health and safety management systems. Some clients will now need to add the quality standard certifications as well. The slides break the standard down section by section, although we won't spend time on all of the sections. We're just going to cover at a high level some of the key changes of the standard. Again, this webinar is not meant to replace formal CIRI R2V3 training for internal auditors or clients. This is an informal resource to get the ball rolling for our clients, give them an idea of where some of those key changes reside, and give them just a general overview of the standard. I mentioned one of the key changes is the implementation of the REC document. You can get a copy through CIRI's website. The intent of the REC, or the R2 equipment categorization document, is that it is to be used in conjunction with the standard. It provides an outline of the requirements associated with evaluating the functionality, cosmetic condition, and data sanitization status for electronic equipment and components. It houses specific categories which can either be used directly from the REC, so utilizing or incorporating the categories from the REC into the R2 facilities, processes and procedures, or conversely, they can be utilized through a cross-reference that clearly demonstrates how the categories in the REC correlate to the categories utilized by the R2 facility. No significant changes to the auditability of related documents. I mentioned already that the revised code of practices is available through CIRI's website. We already covered how the process requirements will vary by R2 facility given their scope. We won't spend time reviewing the definitions in the R2V3 standard, but I did want to include this summary screen that certainly indicates the changes to the terminology used in the standard. Several of these terms will look unfamiliar to someone who hasn't reviewed the R2V3 standard, and a number of these terms existed in R2 2013, but you'll find revised definitions within the R2V3 standard. I encourage you to get familiar with the terminology used and the definitions for these terms as you prepare for your R2V3 audits. Starting with the core requirements, core requirement 1 focuses on scope. It dictates everything to be included in the R2 audits, the R2 scope of certification, and the certificate itself. One important change here is to ensure that the external processes, activities, and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification are included if there are any. It's also important to keep in mind that services outside of the facility could still be related to the facility's operation in a way that necessitate their inclusion. Some examples include off-site collection of electronics, mobile data destruction services, any services that could be performed at a customer site, such as, again, the data destruction, the repair or refurbishing if that's taking place at a customer site. This will vary by R2 facility, but the potential is there for those outside services or offsite activities to be relevant to the audit and the scope of certification. Core requirement 1 also dictates information that needs to be included on the R2 certificate itself. There's a new requirement as well for the R2 facility to maintain and publicly communicate a current and ongoing list of its other locations if they are not certified to R2, if they're owned and operated by the R2 facility, and if they're used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. So SERI looks very closely at, and certification bodies as a result are required to sample very closely the way R2 facilities advertise their R2 certification to ensure it's not misleading to the general public, implying sites are certified if they're not, or certified to an extent that differs from the actual scope of certification. And one area of continued issues would be instances where R2 facilities own multiple locations, not all of which are certified. It's really important to ensure that the advertising of certification is clear, so it is not implying all sites are certified, if that's not the case. R2V3 goes a step further and requires a list be maintained and publicly communicated, so there is no misleading information or no potential for misleading use of logos or R2 certification phrases. By maintaining this list, this addresses that particular concern. This is found in core requirement 1. Organizations that have been identified by SERI to market deceptively or fraudulently relay their certification activity, to have participated in illegal trade. There are a number of items that could fall into this category, but core requirement 1 also prohibits R2V3 certification for any R2 facilities that fall into this category or have been identified by SERI for at least 24 months. So you would be prohibited from pursuing R2V3 if you've been identified by SERI to have taken part in these activities. Core requirement 2 focuses on the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. Since there are no significant changes to the intent of the standard, this section is relatively unchanged. We see some changes to terminology used, references to the core requirements rather than the provisions, but otherwise reuse continues to be the first choice, followed by materials recovery for recycling, and ultimately final disposal as a last choice. Core Requirement 3 focuses on the environmental health and safety management system requirements. Just as with R2 2013, the standard recognizes ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 to satisfy the EHS prerequisites, or it also accepts or will be satisfied by the RIOS standard. These are for the EHS management system requirements. This is not relevant to the additional need for a certified QMS that I mentioned earlier, depending on the appendices. Core Requirement 3 also requires the R2 facility have a process to periodically evaluate relevant hazardous substance exposures. This will vary by R2 scope and the types of focus materials processed by the facility, but some examples could include mercury exposure, lead, beryllium, cadmium, polychlorinated biphenyls, phosphor compounds, flame retardants, silica dust, and hexchrome or hexavalent chromium. Core Requirement 3, under this same sub-requirement, requires industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements for high-risk activities. So in instances where high-risk activities are part of the scope of operation, such as materials recovery activities, there are additional requirements to which clients that fall into that category would be subject. We also see additional requirements in Appendix E for materials recovery, which we will touch on later. Core Requirement 3 specifies minimum accommodations or requirements for employees. It also touches on the need to control or prevent contamination transport to areas where food and drink are allowed. So if an area is not maintained contaminant free, controls to prevent the consumption of food and drink in those specific areas. Again, this is going to vary by the types of focus materials handled at the facility, the types of hazardous substances to which their employees could be exposed, as well as the results of the periodic evaluations or exposure assessments. Core Requirement 4 covers legal and other requirements as applicable. Core Requirement 4 requires documentation of the applicable legal requirements to which the R2 facility is subject. This could include export, transit, and import regulations for international shipments. As a reminder, this is not limited to exports initiated by the R2 facility, but also extends to exports throughout the recycling chain, even if they're initiated by the R2 facility's downstream vendors. Core Requirement 4 also requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations that an R2 facility may receive, and to notify their certification body within 30 days if they receive a notice of violation that requires any action or follow-up activities. Core Requirement 4 also prohibits child and forced labor with references to the International Labor Organization's definitions of applicable terms. It boils down to really any circumstances where workers cannot leave at will or terminate employment if they wish to do so. Prison labor is prohibited unless workers are compensated beyond room and board and are taught skills to be used to obtain employment upon release. Core Requirement 4 also includes a requirement for a non-discrimination policy. Core Requirement 5 focuses on tracking throughput. It requires a summary report be maintained for all transactions, both inbound and outbound. materials controlled by the R2 facility. Summary reports aren't specifically defined, but it is inclusive of all those transactions. It's not meant to be a summary in the sense that it gives examples or a snapshot, but rather includes all transactions. Core Requirement 5 also specifies record contents, such as ensuring accurate dates are included, detailed descriptions, etc., for those inbound and outbound materials so that the tracking throughput records are accurate and complete. Total inventory levels need to be maintained below any limits set by applicable legal requirements, as well as the facility's closure plan. R2V3 requires materials with a negative value or R2 controlled streams be processed within 1 year, unless it meets specific exceptions, including components that have been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C test and repair, or where permissible, items that are stored beyond that 1 year limit due to a lack of response for export approval from the governing authority when permits or authorizations were submitted by the appropriate deadline. So if it's beyond your control because you're waiting for export approval and you submitted everything by the deadline, then going beyond the 1 year would be acceptable. Core Requirement 6 focuses on sorting, categorization, and processing. It's significantly restructured and contains a number of references to the REC. Core Requirement 6 requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing those controlled and processed materials with prescriptive subject matter. All materials need to be managed and processed as an R2 controlled stream unless they meet specified criteria. So when materials are coming from another R2V3 certified facility, if they are already categorized per the REC, that category can be utilized without any need to sample or confirm. If it's been processed by a non-R2V3 facility and given categories that correlate to the REC, then the R2 facility is responsible for conducting a sampling in addition to verifying the non-R2V3 facilities process for conducting that activity. Alternatively, sampling is not required if there are test records and verification records for each individual unit. Another exception would be if the material is no longer an R2 controlled stream, which is where it's really important to become familiar with the R2V3 definitions. All equipment and components are to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the REC. We don't want to make an assumption that there is not data or there couldn't possibly be data. So evaluating for data is an important part of R2V3. Continuing along that same line, it's also important to control any equipment or components that may contain data per core requirement 7 requirements. So we'll get to core requirement 7 next, but again, thinking along the same lines here. We don't want to assume there isn't data. We don't want to not secure equipment or components that could have data. So the requirement is written very clearly into the standard to do so. If there are contractual requirements to not reuse material, they're still subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 7 and Appendix E materials recovery. Identification requirements for equipment or components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse are detailed in Core Requirement 6, and there are references to applicable appendix requirements where they relate to those expectations. There are specific requirements for electronics or components to be evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream. That's a term you can find in R2V3, and there's more information in the rec. If you're dealing with unrestricted streams, these other specific requirements do kick in, including handling them separately from the R2 controlled streams, being able to justify classifying them as unrestricted streams, having appropriate tracking records maintained, and that is inclusive of any reasons for return. Those are just a couple examples of some of those additional unrestricted stream requirements. Core Requirement 6 also specifies requirements associated with transferring functioning product. So those are equipment or components that have demonstrated functionality according to the rec. Some of those requirements include identifying the rec or equivalent categories for functionality, data sanitization status, and cosmetic condition, having unique identifiers used on the sale and shipping records, verifying shipment legality prior to each international shipment, packaging requirements found in Core Requirement 10, return policy requirements found in Appendix C. Physical labels are not necessarily required. There are other means of identification and tracking that would be acceptable, and there are no significant changes to the collectible and specialty electronics expectations. Core Requirement 7 focuses on data security. All R2V3 facilities are required to maintain a data sanitization plan because, again, all of the core requirements apply to all R2V3 facilities, whereas only some of the appendices or process requirements will apply to a given R2V3 facility. There are procedural expectations alongside the data sanitization plan with prescriptive subject matter. I've listed some examples on this slide, but you can find those details within Core Requirement 7. There's also requirements for a written data security policy and assigning a competent data protection representative. There's an expectation that the risk of theft and unauthorized access will be considered within the R2 facility's security program as well, dealing with electronics that could contain data of varying significance or varying levels. Core Requirement 7 requires different levels of security permissions with controlled access as relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of the data that could be managed by the R2 facility, any applicable legal and other requirements. So sometimes customers or upstreams have specific requirements that would be relevant here, all of which is to be authorized by the data protection representative. Written acknowledgements are to be maintained for those granted security authorizations, and these need to address the individual responsibility for each to prevent the release of data, report theft or data breaches, etc. Core Requirement 7 requires an incident response procedure for the investigation of both potential and actual breaches of security or data, as well as to ensure the notification of relevant parties. Core Requirement 7 requires a defined process to demonstrate destruction processes are 100% effective. So no sampling allowed there, that is 100% effectiveness. Under Core Requirement 7, devices may be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor with a written contract if they've been verified according to Appendix A. So Appendix A contains additional criteria for a downstream vendor conducting data destruction to adhere to. And that's in instances where the R2V3 facility itself is not going to be the one doing the sanitization or destruction. Core Requirement 7 requires at least annual, internal data security and sanitization audits to validate the data sanitization processes, and that needs to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. Core Requirement 7 also requires a process for providing information to suppliers upon request, including changes to their relevant downstream vendors and any security breaches. Core Requirement 8 houses the focus material expectations. It includes requirements to demonstrate the recycling chain's capability to process focus materials as planned. It also requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart when the R2V3 facility is not the final point of processing or the end of life entity. According to Appendix A, this needs to include international movements or international shipments all the way through final disposition, or conversely can stop at the first R2 certified tier. And anywhere we see R2 certified or R2 facility in the R2V3 standard, they are meaning R2V3 certified. R2 2013 certified is not recognized within the R2V3 standard. R2V3 includes or places alkaline batteries that don't contain mercury under Core Requirement 2 alongside print cartridges rather than as a focus material. Conversely, R2V3 considers even lead-free circuit boards to be focus materials. Excuse me. Core Requirement 9 focuses on facility requirements. It requires indoor processing in most instances, indoor storage in most instances, ensuring appropriate insurance coverage is maintained given the size and scope of operations, which is not a once and done evaluation since size and processing volumes is subject to change at a given facility. So that is a static approach. Closure plan is required under Core Requirement 9 to ensure appropriate commercial businesses are utilized to manage any electronics under their control. R2V3 presents some exceptions to the need to hold a financial instrument to cover closure costs in the event of abandonment. For an organization to meet these exception criteria, they need to check all 3 boxes. So if the total closure costs are less than 10,000 US dollars and the size of all buildings owned, leased, or used by the R2 facility is less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility never accepts equipment or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. If they check all 3 of those boxes, then the R2V3 facility is not required to maintain a financial instrument. Core Requirement 10 focuses on transport, the need to package materials for transport securely, and in adherence with Core Requirements 4 and 7 as applicable. If transporting data containing equipment or components, there are additional security measures, including tracking shipments, obscuring contents, and contracts with the transporters. Again, we see the need to ensure codes, descriptions, transportation paperwork are accurate and complete in alignment with any applicable regulatory or other requirements. Moving right along to make sure we have time for questions. The second half of the standard focuses on the process requirements. These will vary by R2V3 facility based on their scope of operations. Appendix A houses the downstream recycling chain requirements or the due diligence expectations, depending on what the recycling chain looks like, whether there are R2V3 tier 1s or non-R2V3 tier 1s, and all of the associated due diligence expectations. As I mentioned, the expectations for due diligence vary by whether the downstream vendor is R2V3 certified or not. Appendix B houses the data sanitization expectations. if the R2 facility is responsible for logical or physical data sanitization, to be able to include that in the scope, Appendix B is required. And there are additional traceability, training, security, controls. Let's see, this is a long list, and this is just some examples of what's in Appendix B. It also requires that the data protection representative approve devices for release subsequent to the required verifications, sampling for logical sanitization of at least 5%. There's a number of requirements in Appendix B. Appendix C focuses on test and repair for R2V3 facilities who will be either conducting testing, repair, or both. This is one of the process requirements that necessitate maintaining a quality certification, such as ISO 9001, RIOS. There are a handful of acceptable standards, and those can be found on CERI's website. Appendix C also requires a written or a documented R2 reuse plan. There are, of course, prescriptive criteria to be included. There's a requirement that materials be processed within 1 year of receipt. There are some nuances there. I tried to provide a really high-level summary of what those appendices include to help clients start to get a sense of what may apply to them. But as we'll discuss later in the presentation, there are some additional steps in which we, as the certification body, will help you confirm appropriate selections have been made. Appendix C also requires test records for each function of each uniquely identified item. Appendix B is for specialty electronics. The core requirement allows up to 1% fall under the specialty category. If you are looking for more than the 1%, you'll need Appendix D, but you will also need Appendix C. So we can't have Appendix D without Appendix C, and because Appendix C requires a certified quality management system to qualify for Appendix D, you'll also be adding that. And Appendix D details criteria in lieu of testing for those types of specialty electronics where the R2V3 facility lacks the technical capability to be able to confirm functionality. So there's a number of requirements spelled out in Appendix D for R2V3 facilities that fall into that category. Appendix E covers materials recovery. So instances where destructive dismantling operations or materials recovery related activities are taking place, perhaps shredding whole electronics, certainly a smelter or chemical or thermal processing. There's a number of methodologies that would fall under this category. In addition to the core requirement 3 EHS requirements we discussed earlier, there's additional environmental health and safety assessment and control expectations, as well as ensuring liability insurance or guaranteed reserves are sufficient to cover the potential for incidents. The last appendix is Appendix F, which focuses on brokering. This applies whether the broker takes physical possession of the materials or directs shipment directly to a downstream vendor. We could see both types of brokers. The brokering appendix or process requirement is another one that requires a certified QMS. There are some nuances with the way brokers are audited in terms of some of the core requirements not applying. But those are based on whether the facility takes physical possession or not. I briefly mentioned the REC. So the R2 equipment categorization document that is meant to be used in conjunction with the standard. This is where we see categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, and data sanitization status. Those can be utilized exactly or via a cross-reference. They can be accepted from other R2V3 facilities, but if the R2 facility is R2 2013 or conversely not even R2 certified, then sampling or test records for each individual item would be required. I'm not going to go through the rec. I just included some snapshots here to give you an idea of how the rec is set up. I encourage you to download a copy of the rec and become more familiar with this as well as you prepare to transition to R2V3. There are some other changes that coincide with the release of R2V3, to which I can give you some inside information. We have requirements from the R2V3 Code of Practice to conduct a contract or readiness review prior to a stage 1 audit to R2V3, as well as prior to an R2V3 transition audit. This activity ensures eligibility of the candidate facility to meet those R2V3 requirements as spelled out in the R2V3 Code of Practice. At PJR, we call this the contract validation. There are changes to the certification structure schemes. There is not a multi-site option in R2V3, so you may see some changed terminology depending on how the organization is structured, including the possibility that several sites are certified separately as single facility schemes under R2V3. R2V3 will allow up to 1 surveillance audit per 3-year cycle to be audited virtually. The rest will be required to be on site as of now. R2V3 requires evidence of implementation for minors and major NCRs within a specified time frame to avoid suspension. It also requires revisits for both minor and major NCRs to verify effective implementation. For clients who are pursuing an initial certification to R2V3, I've also included an overview of the certification process. The first step would, of course, be to download a copy of the standard, establish the system documentation as specified or required by the standard, conduct any training that may be required, implement those management system requirements. This is inclusive of an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and a management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as Perry Johnson registrars to conduct those audits. You'll also need to submit any pre-qualification information such as those required for the contract validation. I'll talk about the stage 1 and stage 2 audits, but just at a high level, once those audits are completed, any resulting nonconformities will need to be addressed before a certificate can be issued. I mentioned the contract validation activity, which is typically a quarter day or a half day long. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review, essentially to confirm readiness to stage 2 and evaluate the appropriateness of the documentation framework. Any NCRs identified need to be resolved before the stage 2 can proceed. The stage 2 audit covers the entire management system, all the samples, all the shifts, all the processes. It really gives us a thorough understanding of the operations and a large sample size to assess the conformance of the management system to the standard. This needs to be on site. The R2V3 stage 2 time is required to be on site. Surveillance audits after the certificate has been issued for the subsequent 2 years are either annual or semi-annual in nature, depending on the contract. Those are not full system audits, but partial system audits, shorter in duration than the stage 2 in most cases. The 3rd year of the cycle constitutes the recertification audit, another full system audit similar to the stage 2 that results in a certificate, and the 3-year cycle starts again. I know I went through that very quickly. I wanted to make sure we had some time at the end for questions. So please go ahead and type those in if you haven't already done so while I switch to my contact information. Should you have technical questions or like to discuss something that would be best suited offline, please feel free to reach out via email or phone. I've also included the contact information for our sales department should you need a quote. Okay, let's see what questions I can answer. Will links directly to the slideshow be emailed to us once it is posted? No, that's not currently our practice. However, if you have difficulty finding it on the PGR website, please email me. I've got my contact information up on the slide here, amatthews@pgr.com, and I'd be happy to send you a link. Similarly, we have a question, how can we download a copy of the information in this slideshow? So through PGR's website, we maintain recordings of the webinars as well as copies of the slides. They're located in two different spots. You can go to PGR's website and locate previously recorded webinars. You will find, once it's posted, a link to PGR's YouTube channel with a recording of today's webinar, and you'll also find an opportunity to download a copy of the slides once they have been uploaded. We've offered this webinar a number of times. You can also find copies of the slides and the recordings from those previous airings. So again, if you have trouble locating them on PGR's website, you may send me an email for assistance. I don't see any other questions. I'll hang out for another moment in case anyone is currently typing. Otherwise, I hope the information is helpful. There are a lot of changes. It's a lot of information. We can't squeeze a ton of detail into an hour-long webinar, but again, I encourage you to review the series knowledge base as you prepare for your transition as well. Feel free to reach out to me with some technical questions. Series a helpful resource as well. And we offer these webinars on about every month. So feel free to circle back around future versions of the webinar or even different subject matter that may be helpful as you prepare for your audit, or if you've transitioned and you are just continuing that knowledge. We'll try and update the content as we continue to audit R2V3. Since I don't see any other questions, I am going to log off for today. Thank you for joining us. I hope it was helpful. Good luck in your upcoming transition or your upcoming audit to R2V3, and have a great day.